So in this class, we'll be looking at the first commandment of the Decalogue. "I'm the Lord thy God, you shall have no other gods before me." As we've mentioned in the introduction in the previous class, we said that the Ten Commandments of the Decalogue, the first three have to do with love of God, and then the fourth to the 10th, the next seven, have to do with love of neighbor. So it's actually the first commandment to be looking at that has to do directly with love of God. And it starts like this: "I'm the Lord thy God, you shall have no other gods before me." It's a commandment that determines man's principal attitude towards God. And we could look at it from many perspectives, but a nice way of summarizing it would be to say that man's attitude towards God consists in practicing certain virtues, in particular the virtues of religion, which is part of the virtue of justice, which consists in giving God his due. While justice deals with giving to each person his due, religion focuses on giving God his due. So the virtue of religion, and the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. So in this class, we'll be seeing how those four virtues come into play in putting God first. We'll start with the virtue of religion. This is the virtue that disposes us to give God what is his due, as we already mentioned. And the acts of virtue of religion, which are acts of worship, include adoration, prayer, sacrifice, and making promises and vows. Adoration, which is the first attitude of a creature towards his creator. That when one sees, one's maker, he says, well, what does one do? Naturally, that one should adore, one should worship. And he who made me, or the person that made that the creature, that's adoration. Prayer consists in, say, that conversation with God. And of course, there are different forms of prayer. There's a prayer of thanksgiving, there's a prayer of adoration, there's prayer asking for forgiveness of sins, and there's prayer of petition. Then sacrifice. What does sacrifice mean? To sacrifice means to offer up something that someone likes to the deity as something that costs us. And it's not just enough to say, to make it say an external sacrifice. But that external sacrifice, that sacrifice is something that I like, is a sign of that interior submission. That giving something someone as a sacrifice implies a certain interior submission. That's about what we say about sacrifice. Then finally, the fourth act of, but the last but not the least act of the virtue of religion is to make promises and vows. A promise consisting of determine to give something to God, while a vow, the difference with a vow now is a vow is a solemn promise that one makes directly to God, not to a third party. You can make a promise to a third party for the sake of God, but a vow is a solemn promise that is made directly to God. Now, looking at the virtue of religion, it's also good to point out that the virtue of religion also leads to a profound respect, reverence, and veneration towards whatever is sacred. It doesn't just stop at focusing on God, but whatever, it also includes all that have to do with God, and also whatever is sacred. All the items reserved for divine worship are holy and should be treated with due respect. And so that virtue of religion, of course, means that one takes care to give that due respect to say the church premises, or things that have to do with the worship of God. And also, it means offering the best to God. A very nice example of that we see, we find it from the book of Genesis. So the sacrifice of Abel is pleasing to God because Abel offers to God the best of what he has. And it's fitting to have, living that virtue of religion also, devotional images for veneration. So, also, under the virtue of religion, it's good to distinguish that when as we said in the previous slide, that all the items reserved for divine worship are holy and should be treated with respect. But it doesn't mean that it's the same respect that we are called to God, we are called to all the things around God, that there are different levels or different degrees of that respect and the degrees of cult or worship. Now, the highest we speak of is the cult of latria. Latria, all these are Greek terms, and latria, which is reserved for God alone, which is the cult of worship or adoration. Then at a secondary level, we refer to the hyperdulia. Hyperdulia, which is the cult that is reserved to the Blessed Virgin Mary alone. Or we could look at it in this way, that hyperdulia is the highest veneration, because dulia refers to veneration, and dulia is what we are called to the angels and to the saints. We venerate them, we respect them, and we only worship God. But to the Blessed Virgin Mary, we give her a veneration that is at a higher level because she had that unique position of being the Mother of God, which we call hyperdulia. So it's dulia, but hyper. And in that sense, we to keep that in mind, that latria for God, which is worship, adoration, dulia for the angels and the saints, which is a simple veneration, and then hyperdulia for the Blessed Virgin Mary, for her unique role as being the Mother of God. The worship of God is called that, as we say in the last slide, the worship of latria or adoration, to distinguish it from that veneration due to the angels and saints, which is dulia or veneration, and the cult honoring the Blessed Virgin, which is called hyperdulia. Now, one may ask, well, why have images if the Old Testament forbids them? It's a common question that many people have asked from time to time. Why have these images? Especially since in the extended version, you could say, of the First Commandment, it forbids making any graven image or worshiping any graven image, either from the sky, of anything that is in the heavens or on the earth or in the seas. But to keep very much in mind that even though the First Commandment forbade images in order to protect the mystery of God and to set the people of Israel apart from idolatry, because they were surrounded by people who are idolatrous, and so not so that they don't fall into the same habits of the people around them, the First Commandment forbade that. But however, since God himself acquired a human face in Jesus Christ, that prohibition against images was repealed in Christianity. God himself takes on human form, and in taking on human form, we reach God. The God is a very nice quote in the Christmas liturgy. We said that through incarnation, that God that was invisible has become visible. That God makes himself visible. And so for that reason, that prohibition against images, the reason to say ultimately of the incarnation, that God taking on flesh, means that prohibition also against images was mitigated. That God repeals it, because through those images, we reach the God that is invisible. We don't worship the image like an idolater would do, seeing the divine power within that image, but to see that image as a means of reaching God. And so through the logic of the incarnation, of Christ's incarnation, we can reach God, which is what the Second Council of Nicaea points out, that prohibition against images, but again, mitigated in the 4th century and then abolished in the 8th century in the Second Council of Nicaea, 787 AD, where it says that by his incarnation, God is no longer absolutely unimaginable. After Jesus, we can picture what he is like. And through Christ, through the image of Christ, and through those sacred images, we can accede with our mind, with our heart, to that God that is invisible. One other thing that the Second Council of Nicaea also points out is that what we call the sacramentality of nature, of the revelation. What do I mean by that? The sacrament, as we saw, we could see in the sacrament, that through the sacrament we reach grace, we receive grace through visible things. And so that even Christ's incarnation is sacramental in the sense that through the God that is visible, through Jesus Christ, we can reach or we can accede to a God who is invisible. Through the water that is poured on a child that is being baptized, one can receive grace that is invisible. So that sacramentality that has a visible, or we say a sensible aspect, a part that can be received by the senses, but that points to something that one cannot access to through the senses, which is grace. So in the same way too, that those images, whether it's a picture of Our Lady in one's room, a crucifix, a holy picture, that through those means that one can accede, one can attain or reach out to either to grace or to a person who is invisible. And that's why we can use those images, not seeing them as an end in themselves, but as a means in order to reach God, or in order to reach that saint or whoever it may be. What are the characteristics of the worship of God? For that worship of God and the cult rendered to the Blessed Virgin, to the angels and to the saints, is an interior act above all, where it has to show itself externally. It's not enough to say, well, I worship God in spirit and in my heart. It has to show itself externally. And besides that, man's own social nature requires that man gives external expression to this internal act of religion and profess his religion in community. In community meaning in public and with others. It's not enough to say, well, I worship God alone. That I worship God with others because I have a social nature. And because I'm also flesh and spirit, what the spirit feels, when the spirit is out to God, has to show itself externally. If I want to approach God humbly, it's not enough for me to lie down on my bed and pray. I could do that. But also that since I'm body and spirit, that the body also has to pray. The body prays when it humbles itself by kneeling down. The body prays when it closes its eyes so that it doesn't look around. The body prays when it bows its head as an expression of worship. And because we are social, while the body and the soul and the spirit pray together with that external expression, which is an expression of the internal act, that he also wants to pray and to worship with others in public. Now we'll look at the sins against the virtue of religion. And here is a long and not a comprehensive list of the sins against the virtue of religion. But we'll go through them very quickly. First of all, we have the sin of superstition, which means to attribute to God or to the divinity power, to attribute the power of divinity to things that are material. There are times that superstition to think, well, and there are many of them that maybe people learn as children, or that, okay, I see a black cat and it means that the devil is going to pass by, or that is a bad luck to walk under ladders, or that maybe for some to whistle at night attracts evil spirits. That's superstition to attribute a divine power or a divine influence to supernatural influence to ordinary things. Idolatry, and the problem with superstition really is that it conditions the power of God. It says that God is not behind these things, and these things will happen whether God likes it or not. And the problem with that is that it means that God is not God, because it's a God that is limited by certain acts or by certain objects. Idolatry, which I think is pretty obvious, is to worship an object, or to give the power of God, to attribute the power of God to a particular object, maybe a false god. But now maybe we look at idolatry and say, well, I'm not idolatrous now. And those are sins of the past, when people worship the sun or the moon or a tree or a sacred tree. But the Catechism speaks of a new idolatry. That idolatry that consists in worshiping money, in worshiping fame, or in worshiping oneself. That's the new idolatry that one needs to be aware of, to be wary of. Not think that, well, I don't worship all these other things, but maybe I'm more interested in the impression that I make on people, on how much money I have as the aim of my life. And then that becomes a new thing that I worship and I put above God. Divination. What is divination? Divination, we say, follows from superstition. When one goes to try divination and magic, one tries to use natural means to influence the power of God, to force God to do my will. And the problem with divination and magic is that one does not seek God's will. In prayer, we seek God's will. But when a person performs divination or magic, black magic now I'm referring to, one wants to, through one's means or through maybe a third party, a shaman or a babalawo or a dibia or whatever it may be, through some rites, force God to do my own will. So I'm not seeking God's will, but I want God to carry out my will. Irreligion consists, of course, divination also maybe show a lack of trust in God when one maybe not seeking God's will and seeking to force God to do my will, but one wants to see the future because the person does not want to entrust that future to God. Irreligion consists in, you say, that abandonment or unconcern for things that have to do with divine worship. And atheism is that denial of the existence of God. Because if one denies the existence of God, then one does not even practice the virtue of religion at all. And there are different forms, as we saw in the previous class. But for example, all the forms of materialism really are all forms of atheism, and especially the Marxist type of materialism. And then there's also the practical atheism, one that does not profess philosophically that God does not exist, but when one behaves as if God does not exist, then one lives atheism. Agnosticism is that position when one does not say that God doesn't exist, but does not deny the existence of God, but does not affirm the existence of God. The person, the agnostic, says, well, I don't know whether God exists or not. I'm not sure. So, well, at the end of the day, many times, the person who says, I'm not sure whether God exists or not, usually acts as if God does not exist. Another thing against the virtue of religion is that sin of tempting God. And when a person says, well, if he really exists, do this, and if you do this, then I will know that you exist. Is a person who said, as scripture says, you should not put God to the test. Is close to agnosticism or atheism in the sense that the person still doubts God's existence, and that's why he decides to tempt God. One can also tempt God by putting one's life unnecessarily at risk. I say, well, God, come and save me from this. When many times God saves people using natural means. Another sin against the virtue of religion is sin of sacrilege. And that sin of sacrilege consists in putting aside or treating with a lot of disrespect the things that have to do with God, or things that have to do with God, or even God himself directly. For example, if one deals with the sacrament, maybe the Holy Eucharist, with a lot of disrespect, when one makes fun of a particular sacrament. And then finally, the sin of simony. Simony consists in using money to try to get a spiritual favor, to influence God's will. It comes from something that happened in the Acts of the Apostles, when a certain Simon Magus goes to see St. Peter, and then he tries to bribe him so that he will give him the power to forgive sins, and also the power to confirm people. And then Simon Peter now curses him for a while and tells him that he has to repent. So that idea of using one's money or influence to acquire spiritual favor and now reducing it instead of being a grace to something that one can buy or can influence with one's power. As if to say, well, I will use God to my own end. And so that's why it's a sin against the virtue of religion. Now, we've already seen part of this character of the worship of God, but we'll see some others now, which consists also in that every person has an obligation to seek the truth and to adhere to it. And to keep in mind, of course, that the gospel is intended for everyone, but no one should be forced to accept it, because the dignity of the person demands respect for his and her freedom. And so, of course, in that freedom of religion, that one has to respect the others may not have received the grace to understand the faith. And for that reason, the state and society cannot prohibit each person from acting in his own area according to the dictates of his own conscience. That there should be that freedom of conscience, because no one can be forced to worship God. Because as you said earlier on, that worship of God above all is an interior act. And so even though the person may be forced externally, if it does not come from within, then it's false. Now we look at the virtue, the other three virtues, the theological virtues, which you see here in this very nice painting, by Raphael Sanzio, the great Raphael painter, who has many works in the Vatican and also in Rome. Who there he paints the classical depictions of the three theological virtues. At the topmost, the center panels are the three theological virtues. The topmost, that person who is praying represents the theological virtue of hope. That hope that prays, that waits, that expects from God. In the middle panel, the second panel in the middle, we have the woman with many children, breastfeeding them, taking care of them, is the classical depiction of the virtue of charity or love that embraces everyone and that takes care of everyone. And then finally, at the bottom, we have the woman holding the Holy Eucharist, as the chalice with the Eucharist that is floating, represents the virtue of faith. Faith above all in the Eucharist. Now look at the virtue of faith. That virtue which, as the letter to the Hebrews says, that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the substance of things, evidence of things not seen. The substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And the whole Christian life really has its source in faith in God. And that without faith in God, there's no point living the Christian life if you don't believe in God. And that is that basis of the Christian life. And our duty towards God is to believe and trust fully in Him and to give witness to Him. That first commandment, the first commandment that we're looking at, asks us not just to have faith in God, but to nourish and guard our faith with prudence and vigilance, and to reject anything which might be opposed to it. And of course, that covers so many things, not just to take care to know my faith, because maybe a person says, I believe, but with time, the person doesn't know some basic things, the person doesn't remember some basic things, and or the person does not grow in one space, like a stunted tree. And so to nourish and guard our faith with prudence and vigilance, and to reject anything which might be opposed to it. And also being careful, that could apply in many things. Rejecting anything that may be opposed to it. Maybe perhaps certain friendships, I know that, well, if I follow this person along this path, I will lose my faith. Or being careful about, not but one's marriage. At times, many people have lost their faith through marriages. Or it may happen that, the school that I go to, or maybe it has to do with parents, the school that they send their children to, because perhaps they may go to a school where they lose their faith. Not immediately, but over time. There's this, or maybe things like one watches, one reads, one listens to, which immediately may not make one to lose one's faith, but over time, they act like that poison that eventually kills the faith. There's this very nice, one of the stories of Agatha Christie, where she narrates, because I call Agatha Christie, there's always a murder and then someone has to investigate. And there was a man who was in his house having breakfast and then he dropped dead. They checked the tea that he drank, there was no poison in it. They checked the bread that he ate, there was no poison in it. They did an autopsy and then they found that there was a large amount of arsenic in his liver. And then they started investigating, where did all this arsenic come from? All of a sudden, how was it injected into his system? And at the end of the story, they discovered that in the man's bedroom, his toothpaste was laced with arsenic. And what had happened that every day he would brush his teeth, and of course, he would swallow a bit. As normally when we brush our teeth, the water and a bit of the toothpaste, actually you swallow a small amount, even though you rinse your mouth. So he was always taking a tiny dose, a microscopic dose of arsenic each day over time until it built up in his system and eventually killed him. At times, the person may say, a person that's careless about those small details, over time they build up and they can kill. They can make one lose one's faith. What are the sins against faith? There's that incredulity and religious indifferentism. To be incredulous means, well, to not take anything, to not to believe. Or that religious indifferentism, which sadly says that, well, that all religions are the same, and so there's no point me bothering myself about one sees all the religions as ways to meet God and of the same value. There is heresy, and heresy consists in denying a truth of faith. A heretic is one who practices heresy, by denying a particular truth of faith, doesn't deny the whole faith, but denies an aspect of faith. He may deny that Mary is the mother of God. He may deny that Jesus Christ is God. He may deny that the Holy Spirit is God. He may deny that there are three persons in one God, and we go on and on. But the main point is that heretic, he may deny that that the Pope is the head of the church. The heretic denies an aspect of faith, and that's what heresy is. Apostasy, you could say, is a broader sense of heresy. That an apostate denies not an aspect of faith, not a truth of faith or some truth of faith, but an apostate denies the whole faith, rejects the whole faith. And usually apply apostasy to someone who had embraced the faith before, and then the person now renounces it eventually. Maybe the person says, well, I'm not going to continue this faith, I reject it, and then maybe the person takes up another faith and then rejects the Christian faith completely. Schism, you could say, is a type of heresy. And what type of heresy are we referring to? Schism applies to one who denies a particular truth of faith, which is the primacy of the Pope, that the Pope is the head of the church. And so a person practicing schism is a person who accepts the other parts of the faith, but is not does not submit to the authority of the Pope. And then, as the word implies, to schism is to break, schismatic breaks. So it breaks that unity of the church under the Pope in order to constitute, you could say, a parallel church, believing every other thing, but not giving that submission to the authority of the Pope. Then, as we've seen mentioned in the previous slide, of course, when a person voluntarily entertains doubts against the faith or puts one's faith at risk, that one also sins against the faith. By putting one's faith at risk by attending particular shows or particular relationships that put one's faith seriously at risk. This does not mean that, of course, that one at times cannot, you say, maybe we can say, friend or have dealings with people who have a different faith, but being prudent enough not to put one's faith at risk, perhaps by asking for clear ideas, or if one has to read a book, necessarily has to read a book, being prudent about what one reads, and if one still has to read that book or watch that film, to be prudent enough to ask advice on things to read or watch that will clarify those doubts that may arise. And then one other thing about, well, when we ask, well, what if I have doubts against the faith? Maybe something I learned when I was young, but now I think it's funny. There's nothing wrong with, like we say, there are two types of doubt. There's a doubt that we could call a negative doubt, that doubt in order to criticize, and that is bad. But and that's what it refers to, that voluntary entertaining doubt against the faith to criticize. But there's a doubt that we call positive, that which wants to understand, which seeks to understand, which is open to say, well, I don't fully understand this. I don't see how this makes sense. And then the person prudently asks, and of course one can ask through spiritual direction, seeking advice in order to better understand. Now we'll look at the virtue of hope, which is that hope which leads us to have full confidence in the help of God. Since if we do not give up the struggle to act as His children by beginning and beginning again, He, in His omnipotence and infinite mercy, will give us eternal happiness. So we hope in God's promise of eternal happiness. And that hope leads us to have full confidence in His help when we need it, but provided that we don't give up the struggle. So it's not a lazy hope that does not struggle and expects God to do everything, but one that struggles and even goes against the grain, that struggles against the odds, knowing that God will help in the moment when his all hope seems lost, as one would say. As a result, hope strongly impels us to act as God wishes and to avoid sin, to do the right thing, which at times is difficult when maybe things, the odds are stacked against one, and to avoid sin, to do what God expects of us, and then avoid things that will separate us from Him. What are the sins against hope? And you see this person there by the sea. The first one is the sin of despair. The most obvious one, which is the opposite of hope. When one feels that, well, God cannot help me, or that the odds are stacked up against me, and so I give up. The second is, we say, the opposite of despair, but the bad opposite. It's not hope, but presumption. Presumption that presumes that God will help without me putting any effort. And that's why there are different types of presumption. I don't put any effort and God will help me. So a person is not repentant of one's sins. A person does not struggle. But that presumption leads one to presume on one's own strength to attain salvation, which unfortunately in history it happens several times. The person that thinks, well, through my own strength, like a certain Pelagius, who felt that he did not need God's grace to struggle to be holy, that by his own effort alone, by his own effort alone, that man can attain heaven, and that's the presumptuous person. But the presumption also may show itself when a person presumes of God's mercy without asking for it. The person commits sins and says, well, God will understand, God will forgive, but the person never asks. The person presumes of God's mercy. And that also is a sin against hope. Then also putting one's final hope in something other than God sins against hope. So that rather than God being the object of one's hope, at times, unfortunately, in our world, it's a person's bank balance that is his hope. His life is to increase his bank balance, or he puts one's hope in himself, or in the impression that he makes on people. Anything that is not God, and putting one's final hope in something other than God. Now we get to the final theological virtue, which is the virtue of charity. That virtue, which is the form of all of the other virtues, which without charity are not living virtues. If we don't, there's no virtue that shouldn't be informed by charity. Hope without charity, without love of God, will not make sense. Faith that doesn't lead to act for love of God for charity's sake will not make sense. Being strong next to the virtue of fortitude without charity, not being informed by charity, will just be rigidity. The virtue of temperance or that sobriety or moderation, if it's not done for God's sake, will just be unnecessary mortification. So, in that sense, that the theological virtue of charity is the form, in that sense, that is what gives life to all the other virtues, because without them, there will not be virtues. The fullness of charity, of course, the Christian life really is the fullness of charity. And loving God as the object of one's charity, loving God means to, first of all, to positively do His will. Not only to avoid what is contrary to His law. Not to say, okay, I want to avoid sin. The Christian life is not just about avoiding sin, but about loving God by doing His will. And of course, one concrete manifestation of this law is to walk. To see one's work as whatever it may be, not just as something that gives me a paycheck or that settles my economic problems, but as God's will for me. And so, seeing it that way, I want to do it well. What sins exist against charity? First of all, that if we think about it calmly, every sin is a lack of love for God. Every time we commit sin, we are telling God that we don't love Him, either directly, we are telling God that we don't love Him, either or indirectly, by not loving our neighbor or by treating our neighbor badly. But more concretely, we could talk about the sins of indifference, that indifference towards God, ingratitude, not being aware of not being aware and not being grateful for the graces that God grants us. Lukewarmness, which is that laziness, or you say that sadness towards the things of God. And so that the person carries them out to sadness towards carrying out the things of God. The person carries them out, but carries them out sadly, as if he's dragged along. We see that one of the classic examples of the lukewarm person is the elder brother of the prodigal son, who is in the father's house, but he's just there complaining. And that's why when the brother comes back, he does not rejoice, because he does not love the father, he doesn't love the brother. He's just doing it and being in the house, carrying out the house chores grudgingly. Then there's the acedia, or spiritual sloth, which is a type of spiritual laziness to carry out the things of God. While lukewarmness deals more with sadness to carry things out, acedia, or spiritual sloth or laziness, has to do more with you see, an incapacity to carry. Not that the person is even sad, but it's worse than being lukewarm. The person lazily or does not carry out, is slow to carry out anything that has to do with God, prayer, worship, work, etc. Anything that has to do, we say, with dealing with God, the person lazy about it. And then finally, hatred of God, which is the antithesis of or the complete opposite of that charity towards God, where the person who lives that hatred of God sees God as somebody who has just a being that limits him, that frustrates him, that gives him laws to obey, and so he opposes him and doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And with this, we end this class on the first commandment. May God bless us.